and I work as the director of the Avodah Justice Fellowship for the Avodah organization. And it's great to be here. Thanks, Mara, for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to learn with everybody. So this week we read Parashat Bechukotai, with which we end the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, the third of the 5 books of the Torah. And the book of the Parashat Bechukotai begins with it presents itself as basically a summary of Torat Kohanim, of the book of Vayikra, of the priestly law and the law in general at this point. Excuse me. After last week in Parashat Bahar, we focused on the last substantive piece of law for the book of the sabbatical law, of giving the land its rest, of being in balance, what later becomes associated with that, remitting debts, maintaining structural equity among the people, resetting the economy every 50 years, making sure that temporary poorness can never become poverty, making sure that lands can never be exhausted from over farming, etc. After that, our Parsha Bechukotai opens with a short section of the blessings to befall all of us if we fulfill the commandments as we've learned them, and a long series of very gruesome and brutal curses if we do not. And then there's an epilogue in the last chapter, which we won't talk about right now. So we're going to focus on one of these particular curses deep into the cycle of spiraling multi-generational communal curses. But before that, I want to ask a broad question. What, in your experience or your thinking, forms Jewish community or Jewish peoplehood? What is your relationship to other Jews, whether you know them or you don't know them? What makes you part of a people or a community with other Jews? I'm going to open it up because we're going to look at one rabbinic tradition that gives the most prominent rabbinic answer to this, but it's good to get kind of like jointly carry our luggage together, what we bring into that conversation. What it is to be, what are your relationships of responsibility to other Jews? Feel free to raise your hand or to click the raise hand icon and feel free to talk. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Rabbi. Thank you for taking my comments. So basically, it's a responsibility, not just to Jewish people, but to the world in general. The way I look at it is there's a few things that I need to focus on. One is I take Halal's teaching, right? Whatever's hateful to me, don't do to others. Kindness, and chesed and tikkun olam, make the world a better place. Those are the things that I strive for and I work towards every day to try and be a better person tomorrow than I was today, right? And I'm a work in progress like everybody else. But I try to impose, I try to have that among other people as well. So the way I look at it, to summarize it, it's very positive energy, and I try and project that, so we get positive energy back. And I'm looking forward to hearing other responses, and I don't want to monopolize the time, but this is a super interesting parsha, and I have some questions about the curses, but I'll save that for another time.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, other hands. While you think about raising your hand, I'll note some of the comments in the chat. Ayala says, being there for people at all moments of life's joys and challenges, being part of community. Richard Plus is doing the right thing. Rob Plus says the #1 obligation of any Jew is to pay temple membership dues. Yeah, any other thoughts, comments?
He's a jokester, don't worry.
Sorry, what?
He's a jokester, don't worry.
Oh, okay. Okay. Go ahead. Any other comments or thoughts? All right, well, let's jump into, so yeah, John Heiderman, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank
There
you.
you go.
So I couldn't really put this in the chat because I can't really form into words, but there's 2 things that come to mind. One is simply a responsibility when I meet Jews who have no connection to Torah learning, to just gently offer them an opportunity, suggest, maybe you'd like to come along to a study session, maybe you'd like to come along to the shul. That's one. And the other is a more kind of general, almost like a sort of a gut feeling, something that I experienced when I was quite young, traveling on my own, doing Interrail in Europe when I was 19, of like a Jewish man coming up to me in the Hungarian embassy and helping me with my visa because he recognized that I was Jewish, and then arranging for me to get accommodation in Budapest with his sister. So sort of almost like more or less a kind of like a sort of family network. And that's perhaps something that I can't really cash out in sort of logical, ethical terms. It's more of a sort of a feeling of just collective belonging and looking out for each other.
That's great. And it's very similarly, Carol Katz wrote in the chat, we're all responsible, one Jew for another, so we must provide for those in need. Jeffrey Kahn, last comment on this, and then we'll jump into some text. Unmute yourself, Jeff.
There we go. That's the ticket. No, all I was going to say, I love what I've heard so far, but I just simplify it by saying participate in the services, participate in studying the Parsha, looking out for each other, just a combination of everything what people have said a moment ago. Participate. It's key to the community.
Great, thank you. We have a side like halachic practice question from an iPhone in the chat. Do some people chat the rebuke in a very quiet, low tone? Yes, that's a common practice. It seems to have sprung up from the grassroots, and halachic authorities of like the 19th century, 20th century to this day dispute it. A lot of them are like, no, this is a really great custom. It helps show the fear, animate the fear involved in this, and other poskim really hate that practice and say, no, the point is that people really need to hear the curses and be warned. So no matter what your congregation's practice is, you have on whom to rely, and that will continue to be a debate for all time. Here I put a link to the document in the chat in case you want to open it on a different screen. I'm going to share my screen and we'll look at some text together. Here we go. All right. So I want to start deep into the curses, verse 37 of chapter 26. At this point, the Jewish people have sinned and refused to heed God's admonitions to repent, and it's been a generational snowballing. And there's one turn of phrase as the Torah describes the state of people's sinfulness. V'chashlu ish be'achiv ki mipnei cherev v'rodef ayin v'lo tiyeh lachem tekuma lifnei oivechem. So they shall stumble, one person by their kin, or in the gender language of the original Torah, a man by his brother, but it's clear from context that it applies to everybody across genders. So I think, one person by their kin, each person by each other. They shall stumble one by another, as before the sword. People are going to fall one with the other, as though they've been hit by the sword, even though there's no rodef, there's no pursuer. The fascinating curse. Earlier, we've seen about enemies will be unleashed against the Jewish people. Here, even if there's no enemy, there's no pursuer, we're gonna collapse and fall down through each other as though there is. And there will be no standing up. Lo tiyeh lachem tekuma lifnei oivechem. We'll have no ability to stand up before our enemies. Now, there's a lot to think about in terms of that verse, what's going on in terms of the punishment of fear, the punishment of terror, of acting as though we're being attacked when we're not being attacked. But I want to focus on another aspect of this verse that Chazal, that the sages really home in on. They shall stumble or fall, one person by their kin. V'kashlu ish be'achiv. So the classical midrash on the book of Vayikra, the Sifra, that's a midrashic work coming out of the same oeuvre as the Mishnah, So published around the year 200. Also, the Mishnah is published as topical, and the Sifra and some other midrashic works go phrase by phrase interpreting the Torah. This comes out of the school of Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, before we go to the next text, do you mind sharing access to the page? People aren't able to access it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks. 1 second.
Thank
Thought
you.
the sharing settings had been set. My bad. Oh, yeah. You are so correct. Here you go.
Thank you.
Okay, that should be all fixed now. Thank you. Sorry about that.
We're in.
Okay. Back where we started. Okay. So the Midrash and the Sifra focuses on this phrase, Ish be'achiv. What does it mean they fall down one person by their kin, or one person through their kin, in their kin? The larger context of the verse makes it sound like we, all of us, the Jewish people, are continuing to stumble out of panic, seeing foes and seeing threats when they're not there. But what is, you could have just said, "Kashlu ki mipnei cherev ve'rodef ayin," they stumble as before the sword, though there be no pursuer. What is the import of the phrase ish be'achiv? So the Midrash says, Eino omer ish be'achiv. It doesn't say one person by their kin. I mean, it does say ish be'achiv, but I think what the Midrash means is it doesn't mean ish be'achiv, literally one person, like that we knock each other down. Ela be'avon achiv. When it says one person by their kin, it doesn't mean that we're fighting and we knock each other down literally, and that's what makes us fall. It means by the transgression of their kin. Each of us suffers through each other's transgressions. This teaches that all of Israel are liable for each other. Melamed shekol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. This teaches that all of Israel are liable or guarantors for each other. Susie Kent, go ahead and ask a question. Unmute yourself, Susie.
On Yom Kippur, when we pray, we don't say, I have sinned. We say, we have sinned.
Mhm.
Our redemption is going to be collective, not individual. So we have to be also when when you're reading like different things about how to behave in character, you're supposed to straighten out someone if they're straying kindly, gently, and in private, not to embarrass them. But if they're not being a good Jew, as it were, it's our job to help them back on the path, not just for them, but for all of us.
Thanks, Susie. And that's a really hard, it was always a really hard mitzvah, and it's certainly a hard mitzvah in pluralistic contexts. Like, what if we have so many different conceptions of the right way to behave, and we're trying to have a big tent community? What is the context in which you can go in and rebuke somebody? So you were speaking about a related mitzvah that I've taught about in context of this. I don't know if we're going to get into it too deeply, but the mitzvah from Parashat Kedoshim, Hocheach tochir et amitecha. And the reason that we have to rebuke each other is so as not to hate each other. People who are conflict averse think that rebuke is something that foments conflict. Let's not have fights at the table. Let's all get along. From the Torah's perspective, rebuke is for the purpose not to have conflict. We're required by Torah to engage in low-grade conflict so that it doesn't fester. If you keep it in, it'll fester, then you're really going to hate each other. And it's just 2 verses away from the mitzvah, Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha, loving each individual Jew is sort of a function of being able to rebuke them. So that seems very related to this, but we may be jumping the gun a little bit. Let's unpack what this means. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. All of Israel are liable for each other. Let's start with the word arevim. I translated it as liable. Sometimes I've seen it rendered as accountable, responsible. It really comes from, it's a word that is used metaphorically here, but it comes from economic law. I'm going to stop share so we can see more faces. Aryeh is a word in economic law. It's a guarantor for a loan, for really any kind of debt. So if I owe Mara $1,000, okay, let's say either Mara lent me $1,000 or I busted up her car or whatever the case may be, and I owe her this money, and I'm not able to pay it back immediately. Let's stick to a loan. That's the easiest. Mara lends me $1,000 and is rightfully concerned that I won't be able to pay it back. So she's only willing to lend me if she has a guarantor that if I default on the loan, she'll be able to get her money back. So I bring in Susie Kent as my guarantor. You hope that I'll be able to pay it back and you won't be on the hook, but you sign on that if I default, you'll be able to be on the hook. A lot of people, like the first time they rent an apartment, have a guarantor, etc. So basic concept in economic law, a guarantor. We're all guarantors for each other. Let's really play out what this concept is. How does this metaphor work? If we are guarantors to each other's debts, and that's somehow related to mitzvot and averot, commandments and transgressions, how does that metaphor work? For what are we guarantors for each other? Feel free to raise hands. Yeah, we'll get to Ayala's comment in a little bit.
Marcy, did I see your physical hand up?
Yeah, go ahead.
We are guarantors for each other's behavior, to kind of watch over each other and kind of say, wait a minute, this isn't kosher, what you're doing or what you're proposing or how you're behaving. And you're kind of putting the community at risk here. So let's reconsider our behavior or our intentions or kind of what's happening.
They fail one person through their neighbor. Yeah, you're somehow on the hook. It's like if God, by giving us the commandments, has given us something of value, and we have a debt to pay to God. And if one of us defaults on our debt by transgressing, then somebody else is accountable for the punishment. There might be contexts in which we're not just individually accountable, but actually when one person transgresses, others might be on the hook for it. We're going to problematize that momentarily. But first, I see Arthur has a hand up.
I actually learned this phrase as all Jews are responsible for one another. The understanding that I had is that this meant that when our fellow Jew was hurting, we had the responsibility to come forward and help. If I forget in which Parsha it's talked about that if your fellow Jew is poor, you need to come forward to help him.
Right. There's certainly numerous mitzvot d'oraita, biblical commandments to intervene for each other's well-being. That is certainly true. But I want to note, Arthur, I mean, we sit here, I'll bring up the text again. What is the origin of this phrase? The origin of this phrase of Kol Yisrael Arevim Ze Bazeh is in a gloss about mutual accountability and punishment for transgression. In the context of the curses of the punishment for collective sin, for generational sin, the Midrash is saying it doesn't really mean one person falls by their kin, by their brother, but by the transgression of their kin. This is the context. So this phrase it might be applied to help animate the full breadth of our relationship to each other, our responsibility for each other, to be including positive things. But the origin of it from this week's Parsha is on our being on the hook. The word arevim is never, in legal contexts, isn't about kindnesses. It's about being on the hook for somebody's default. And that is metaphorized to the context of transgression. So I want to play out a little more. The Talmud in two places, I brought one of them here, records that midrash and unpacks it a little more. So I want to read that with you. So it is taught, and it brings our midrash as a baraita. And when the Talmud, Sanhedrin 27b, it's also in Shavuot. So this is actually a different part of the curses. 2 verses later, I think, yeah, 2 verses later. I think I might have taught about this last year or the year before on this parsha. Intergenerational responsibility. I think I taught about reparations and Jewish thought, and the idea that came from really this verse, that what does it mean to be accountable for the sins of ancestors? But we'll leave that for another time. So the curses 2 verses later say, also in the iniquities of their ancestors shall they pine away, shall they melt away with them. And that's really problematic. An earlier midrash says, like, what do you mean people can be punished for the sins of their ancestors? The Torah explicitly says in Devarim 24, which we'll get to in a minute, one person shall be executed for their own sin. There's personal responsibility. If my grandparents ate pork, that was their own choice. Why would I be responsible for that? I had nothing to do with that. That seems really unjust. And in fact, they're all prophetic passages about that. Yechezkel goes on a whole thing about how that was a previous notion. It's unjust. Each person should die for their own sins. It's codified in Devarim 24. So, and really that challenge applies to our verses also. Like, what does it mean that we're guarantors for each other's sins? If somebody else is doing something terrible, and I think that's a terrible thing for them to do, why should I be on the hook for it and be punished when I'm not doing the thing that they're doing? So we're going to get to that. But here on the question of vertical mutual accountability, ancestral accountability, the Talmud glosses and says, this, where we're punished for the sins of our ancestors, this is where we grasp onto the actions of our ancestors with our hands. So it's like a little different shape. If I don't just independently make a choice to do a transgression, but I continue, let's say my grandparents started a family business based on extortion, and I inherited the business and I don't shut it down, I keep the business going, then I'm accountable not just for my own sins, but for these continual sins because I haven't broken the chain. So the Talmud, the editorial voice asks, do you say this is where they grasp, or perhaps it applies even where they do not grasp? But wait a second, maybe the Torah means more broadly. No, the verse states in Deuteronomy 24, a person shall be put to death for their own sin. So that in Leviticus, where it says that we're accountable for the sins of our ancestors, that's where they grasp on the actions of their ancestors in their hands. So the general rule is a person is accountable for their own personal sins, and the gloss of Leviticus that we can be punished for the sins of our ancestors, that's only where we hold on to those sins in our hands, where we maintain the sins of our ancestors and we have not radically rejected our ancestors and broken the chain. So the Gemara asks, well, aren't they though? Aren't we actually held accountable for other people, even if we don't hold on to them on our own? Aren't we held accountable for other people's sins? After all, isn't it written, our verse, they shall stumble, one person by their kin, which means one person by the transgression of their sin, which teaches that all of them are liable for one another, all of them are guarantors for one another. Kulan arivim ze bezeh. Don't we have this same idea of mutual liability, accountability for sin in a horizontal way? And the Talmud concludes, Hatam, that context, our midrash, our verse, that people are held liable for this, or guarantors for the sins of other people. That's where they had the ability to protest, and they did not protest. And this sort of draws on an idea of 4 early Amoraim recorded in Talmud Bavli Masechet Shabbat, Rabbi and Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Chaviva, and then there's an editorial gloss that probably should be not Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yonatan. Anyone who has the ability to protest against the people of their household, but did not protest, is apprehended for the people of their house. So if people in your household are transgressing and you didn't object, you're accountable for that. Anyone who has the ability to protest against the people of their city, they're apprehended for the people of their city, meaning, and if they didn't protest. Anyone who has the ability to protest against the people of the whole entire world, but did not protest, are apprehended for the whole entire world. Nitpas al kol ha'olam kulo. This gets back to, I think Susie was raising earlier, like the mitzvah of rebuke. This passage uses a different word. The word for rebuke in Vayikra 19 rather, is hocheach tochiach. And the word here is limchot, protest, object. So what the relationship is between those, I think, is an interesting thing to consider. They definitely seem thematically related, though not identical. So I want to consider with you, what's at stake here? What we've said from our Parsha is that if we see other Jews doing things that we understand to be criminal, and we have the opportunity, we have the possibility of interrupting it, and we don't do that, we're accountable. We're their guarantors. And what follows from that is that if you do protest and they continue on with their behavior, you're off the hook. You're not their guarantor anymore. They have broken this guarantor relationship. The guarantor relationship in the metaphor is based on their attempt to pay their debt, but their inability to do so, and we help each other. We help each other out by bearing the burden of each other. That is the origin of let me say this differently. The Talmud has one basic statement about what Jewish peoplehood is, and this is it. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. And in its own context, there's certainly many other individual obligations toward each other, but this concept of peoplehood, of being a collective, is about responsibility for each other's wrongdoing and the necessity to protest. So let's open that up. I'm gonna, while people think, I'll notice some comments and questions in the chat. Gail asked, what does protest mean exactly? Great question. Jim asked, is there a distinction between sin and crime here? Not the way I'm using it. Using different words, but more or less interchangeably. ILL referring to the other verse, talk about epigenetics, controversial idea in science right now. Yeah, okay. So hands, I see Ayala and then Paul. Go ahead, Ayala.
Hi, thank you. I think the key to this idea of being responsible one for the other is in that word Aryeh, which I put in the chat before, because it means a mixture. Like, we are not going through this world in a bubble by ourselves. We are connected. Mm-hmm. And that has implications. And right now, the whole world is showing us that we are all joined together, mm-hmm. right? And so how can we not be responsible one for the other? Because the blessings come to us, not to one person, mm-hmm. right? And the consequences affect all of us, not one of us.
And I love that you made that linguistic connection. Thanks for reminding me, because I forgot to come back to it in the chat. Right. So the word arev means a guarantor, somebody who pays somebody else's debt. And it also, as Ayla correctly points out, means mixed up with. Erev means evening because it's dusk. It's when light and dark start to mix together. Me'orav means mixed up. It's like if you're baking, and that's like arev, it's a kemach, it's a maim, it's a bitzim biachad. You're like mixing everything together. Now, I want to really unpack what's significant about what the rabbis are teaching us here, though, because there is a very common way of thinking about being mixed up, being all together, which is that we have to maintain unity. I mean, actually, even right now, but really in every generation, a lot of people will say, you can't protest. That shows disunity. And that, that could strengthen the hands of other people, etc. Like we have to stay together, and now's not the time to protest. And what the rabbi says is exactly the opposite. That which makes us mixed in with each other is dependent on protest. I mean, unless we all act perfectly and in the same way all the time, but that seems unlikely. But it's protest that is the only thing that can help us discharge our obligations as guarantors. If we don't protest, if we just, for the sake of unity, sake of being together, quiet down and don't object when we see people doing things that we think or know to be wrong, that's when we're on the hook and we're liable for more divine punishment. When we're freed of divine punishment is when when everybody shows like what they think the lines are of appropriate behavior, when we speak up about it. And that is an act of disunity. What makes us me'orav is that we're accountable to the same source. And what God expects of us is showing disunity when there isn't consensus about performing the divine will. Now, of course, this opens up a lot of rancor and hostility, and two people can have mutually exclusive ideas of what the right and the good is, of what God's commandments are. And maybe you'll just be shouting past each other. And I know the Torah here, the Chazal don't really give us a pathway toward what happens then when everybody's protesting at each other and they're at an impasse and nobody's listening or nobody's changing their behavior because everyone thinks everyone else is wrong. That's kind of where we're at. But so we're going to have to think about other pathways for getting out of that problem. But I think unavoidably Chazal are directing us that that's the place we need to be. That the only thing worse than that is the place of holding back one's protest because we're supposed to be together. No, our togetherness necessitates our protest. That's the halacha. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. With respect to this, and I think Ayala nailed it, with the blessings and the curses, because we have a covenant with God, and it's a contract essentially. And reading this parsha about rejecting my laws and spurning my rules, I take it as we're all being talked to collectively. It's not individual. So when I think about that, I see the consequences are grim, and as far as the Israelites are concerned, if one person doesn't observe the commandments, I mean, does everyone have to pay? I had a conversation with my wife on this, and she referenced, that expression about, it taking just one bad apple. So the way I'm reading this is like, it's a warning that if the Israelites are ever exiled, we'll suffer and under constant threat of being wiped out. And when you read through it, it turns out that, because we have the covenant, God will keep it, meaning that we won't disappear completely. And then I'm wondering, Rabbi, I'd love to get your take on this, that, looking at it through this lens, doesn't it summarize the last 2,000 years of, what's been happening to our people?
I'll respond to the prior thing. That the latter one seems very broad, and I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly. But the prior question, when you asked about if somebody else sins, are you responsible? I think that's exactly the topic here. And it says, yeah, you're on the hook for divine punishment unless you object in whatever sphere you have the ability to do so. So the more power you have socially, the more on the hook you are. If you are, if you have access to people in power and you don't use that access for it to create divine conflict, then you're more responsible. If you don't have a lot of power, then you're not going to be held responsible for not protesting against something you didn't have access to. But remember, that's what the Talmud says. If you have the ability to protest against your household and you don't do that, then you're held accountable. Now, if you're in a situation of violent suppression, that, there's abuse in your household and you could be really hurt or kicked out or something if you object to bad behavior, then I think that would be considered in the language of Talmud Masechet Shabbat. You don't have the ability to protest in that context, so you're off the hook. But if you have the ability to object to bad behavior and you don't do it, that's when you're on the hook. That is the nature of our togetherness. What it means for Jewish unity is that we're all on the hook for each other. We're responsible for each other because the Jewish people has constitutive value only on the grounding of the covenant, according to rabbinic thought. Nancy, go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, isn't like the flip side of this where if you see somebody hurt, it's my responsibility as a Jew to help them. If I see, somebody cross the street, I'm not allowed to stand idle. And that goes for the positive stuff and the negative stuff. And I see a direct parallel. It doesn't necessarily need to be a direct commandment. Well, everything we do is just to do the right thing.
Well, you do have direct
taking
commandments.
action.
Right, you do have direct commandments on things like that. For example, elsewhere in Parashat Kedoshim, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. And actually, that's in the same cluster of commandments with rebuke and love. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. You're not allowed to stand by the blood of your comrade. So if you see somebody in danger, you have the responsibility to take on some risk. The rabbis will engage the question of how much risk. Like if somebody's drowning and you don't know how to swim, then you wouldn't be violating lo ta'amod al dam re'echa if you don't jump in, because that's not going to be helpful. But if you have the ability to protect somebody, you have to do that. If you have a friend who's abusing heroin and is in danger for their life, you got to figure out how to have an intervention, how to do what you can to interrupt behavior and keep people alive. So there's like rich literature about that. And I think on that positive sense of how to support people, and certainly we have myriad mitzvot about social welfare, interrupting, making sure that poorness never becomes poverty, interrupting the barbarity of the free market, and to make sure that people are protected. That's an individual and a societal obligation. We have myriad mitzvot about that. About social welfare. And those are, I think, addressed very specifically. But to my knowledge, we don't see them drawn out into a conceptual peoplehood framework, except for here, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, and that context is in the context of responsibility for people's transgressions and the obligation to protest. Now, because earlier, I believe it was Susie, brought up the related concept of rebuke. I didn't put it on this source sheet, but I'll share my screen and walk you through a couple of the key sources on that, because I think it is very relevant. So we have this is Parashat Kedoshim a few weeks ago. So do not go around slandering among your people. Don't stand over the blood of your fellow. That's what we just talked about. Lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, ani Adonai. Don't hate your kinfolk in your heart. Really rebuke your comrades so you don't bear sin on their account. Don't avenge or bear a grudge against your fellows, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am Hashem. So loving your neighbor seems really linked to not hating them, and the way to the pathway toward not hating them, and maybe the grounds for being able to love them, is rebuking each other. We see this expressed most clearly in a midrash in Breshit Rabbah 54:3. I'll just cut to the chase of it for our time purposes. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina. Any love that's not together with rebuke is not love. Kol ahava she'eini matochacha eina ahava. So anytime you see, people being reprimanded for protesting or for offering criticisms of, one group of Jewish people's behavior on something, and they're reprimanded by saying, like, why aren't you showing love for your people? Why are you out here protesting? That's an anti-Jewish idea, like the rabbi, or at least anti-rabbinic. The rabbis say it's the opposite, and I think it's implicit in the Torah verses that love has to be grounded in rebuke. Without love, without rebuke, without the possibility of rebuke, that's not love. That's just complicity. Love can only spring from the grounds of rebuke. The rabbis also note that rebuke is extremely difficult. The Talmud Bavli and Masachet Aryeh, Rabbi Tarfon says, I'd be shocked if there's anyone in our generation who can receive rebuke. Somebody offers some rebuke and they just like throw it back at them and say, your face. Like, people are not able to receive it gracefully. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah seems to think the problem is in a different location. I'd be shocked if there's anyone in our generation who knows how to rebuke. People don't do it right. So that's really hard. I don't want to treat that as a trivial problem. We're going to leave it at that very hard note. And that another Gemara says, just as it's a mitzvah to say that which will be heeded, it's also a mitzvah not to say that which will not be heeded. Sometimes it's better to hold back. But that brings us back to those Torah verses in Parashat Kedoshim. If we hold back, then there may be no mechanism for hatred not to swell up in our heart. So if I notice you doing something disgraceful, and I don't have the ability to say so, either because of your weakness or mine, then hatred is going to well up. And the possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, of loving your neighbor as yourself, may not be available. That's a real problem. So we have to work very hard on creating the context for gracious flow of rebuke. And I think the text that we looked at in our context of communal protest is related to that. Like, I think if rebuke is more on an individual level and protest is more on a collective level, that is what makes us, our Jewish peopleness, is that we are all on the hook. We have an interest, a literal interest in each other's fulfillment of the commandments. We have rancorous disagreements on the right way to do that is. And sometimes people just show willful disregard. And from the perspective of Chazal, what makes us bound up with each other, the meaning of our togetherness of Jewish peoplehood, is our accountability for each other's wrongdoing, and therefore our required protest. Anytime you see Jews who don't agree with you protesting against however you identify, them protesting against you, that is not a sign of fracturing of Jewish peoplehood. That is a sign of Jewish peoplehood, and it should be embraced. That is the fulfillment of the mitzvah. And saying that, like, in order to have Jewish love or Jewish togetherness, we have to silence protest, that's an anti-Jewish, anti-rabbinic idea. And I'll leave it at that. I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. You should be strong, and together we'll strengthen each other as we finish the book of Vayikra. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.